I won't go to my mother.
Why the hell not? You go to your father every chance you get.
I only go to you when you go to me.
For 9 seasons, Carroll O'Connor brought America's most controversial father to life, but the price was higher than anyone imagined. His 9-year-old son, Hugh, once found himself replying to hate mail, forced to defend a father who wasn't really Archie Bunker at all. That was the strange reality of Carroll O'Connor's success. His role didn't just live on screen, it bled into his home, his family, and his friendships. And when Carroll finally spoke about the actors he hated most, it wasn't about Hollywood rivals or critics. It was closer, sharper, and far more personal. But who were they? The Norman Lear power struggle.
Did you have a bad ending with Carroll O'Connor?
No. Well, he was very unhappy with certain aspects of our relationship.
Carroll's biggest battles weren't with actors at all. They were with the man who created Archie Bunker. And if you thought Carroll O'Connor was just a hired hand reading lines, you'd be wrong. This was a war over control, and it played out behind the cameras in ways audiences never saw. From the outside, All in the Family looked like a flawless hit. Every week, Archie Bunker's arguments about race, politics, and the changing America had millions of families glued to their screens. But off camera, Carroll was fighting for Archie's soul, and the man standing in his way was Norman Lear, the genius who built the show, but also the producer who insisted he alone knew what was best. That clash didn't take long to boil over. Carroll saw Archie not as a caricature, not as just a punchline, but as a full human being. Lear, on the other hand, wanted Archie to remain a kind of symbol, a mirror to the uglier side of American attitudes. Carroll bristled at that. He once admitted, "I got very nasty with him. I fault myself. I didn't have to get that nasty." And yet, those weren't words of regret so much as confession. Carroll was fighting to protect his character from becoming, in his mind, a cartoon. Think about it. O'Connor had built his career on serious, often intense roles before Archie. He wasn't a comedian, he was a dramatic actor. So when he saw the scripts turning Archie into an easy target, a man written to be laughed at instead of laughed with, he dug in his heels. He pushed back on dialogue, rewrote lines, and demanded rewrites to keep Archie dimensional, even sympathetic. He believed that if Archie were portrayed as nothing more than a fool, the show would collapse under its own smugness. This created explosive meetings with Lear. Scripts were thrown out, words were shouted, and at least once, O'Connor threatened to walk away. But not for the reasons most people assume. It wasn't about money or fame. It was about dignity. Carroll believed Archie's flaws only mattered if audiences could see the humanity beneath them. Without that, the show was preaching, not storytelling. And here's the part people rarely talk about. CBS executives actually sided with Lear at first. To them, O'Connor was being difficult, slowing down production and causing chaos. But when the ratings climbed, they couldn't ignore that O'Connor's instincts were part of why Archie worked. He made viewers uncomfortable, yes, but he also made them think. That balance of comedy and raw truth turned All in the Family into a cultural earthquake. O'Connor once admitted the fights could get personal. He recalled a time when he got very nasty with Lear, and it wasn't just about scripts. It was about who truly owned Archie Bunker, the actor who gave him breath, or the creator who wrote him into existence. And while they clashed, both men knew they needed each other. Lear's boldness and O'Connor's sensitivity combined to create a character who became a national mirror. But it was a mirror held together with duct tape and bruised egos behind the scenes. Now, here's a question for you. If you were Carroll O'Connor, would you fight your producer to protect your character? Or would you just read the lines and cash the checks? Because Carroll wasn't bluffing when he threatened to quit. At one point, he refused to return to the set, holding out until he got script changes he believed were necessary. And instead of being replaced, Lear and the studio caved. That's how much power Carroll's presence brought to Archie Bunker. He wasn't just an actor anymore, he was the show's moral compass, even when the morals were messy. But here's where things get interesting. For all the heated battles, Carroll O'Connor never listed Norman Lear as one of the people he hated most. Their fights were fierce, but Lear wasn't his enemy. In Carroll's eyes, Lear was a sparring partner, not a traitor. Their fights made the show better, even if it nearly tore the production apart. Which brings us back to the question driving this story. If Norman Lear wasn't the actor Carroll hated most, then who was? Who betrayed Carroll's trust so deeply that he never forgave them, and in fact, never even spoke their name again? The mystery co-star revealed.
I'm going to tell you what's going to happen around here. Edith and I are going to vote, so that's going to cancel your 2 votes. So from this house, you get zilch.
And here's the twist. The co-star Carroll O'Connor never forgave wasn't a bitter rival, wasn't a fading guest star, and wasn't Norman Lear. It was someone he had once called family, someone he protected, guided, and even adored during the making of All in the Family. It was Rob Reiner. Now, that might sound strange at first. On screen, Carroll and Reiner had chemistry that carried some of the show's most profound scenes. Remember that tense but tender moment when Archie tells Mike, "Stifle it," and both men break into an unscripted silence? That was partly ad-libbed, a rare collaboration where Reiner and O'Connor trusted each other enough to improvise. Those moments convinced fans they were as close off camera as they were fiery on it. And for a time, that was true. Carroll treated Reiner almost like a son. But years later, Rob Reiner gave an interview that shattered that bond. And this wasn't a casual remark or an offhand joke. It was something Carroll O'Connor could never unhear. Reiner, reflecting on All in the Family, described Archie Bunker not just as ignorant, but as dangerous. He claimed Archie represented the darkest instincts in America, and that audiences who cheered for Archie instead of laughing at him were basically endorsing racism. It was a bold take, one that fit Reiner's political voice as he built a career as a director and activist. But to Carroll O'Connor, it was more than analysis. It was a betrayal. Think about it. Carroll had fought Norman Lear tooth and nail to make Archie more than a cardboard bigot. He believed Archie was complicated, conflicted, and, whether you liked it or not, someone audiences recognized in their own lives. To Carroll, Archie wasn't dangerous. He was real. And Carroll poured years of his own heart, stress, and even his family's peace of mind into defending that. So when Rob Reiner publicly framed Archie as a harmful symbol, it cut Carroll to the core. It wasn't just disagreement, it was his protege rewriting the story, painting Carroll's proudest work as something toxic. Carroll didn't just feel criticized, he felt abandoned by someone he had once championed. And here's how deep that wound went. Carroll O'Connor stopped mentioning Rob Reiner by name. In later interviews, when asked about his cast, he would talk about Gene Stapleton. He would praise Sally Struthers. He would even mention Norman Lear, despite all their battles. But when it came to Rob Reiner, Carroll only referred to him as the boy. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was deliberate, a pointed erasure. For a man as precise with his words as Carroll O'Connor, calling Rob Reiner the boy was his way of shrinking him down, denying him the respect of adulthood or equal status. It was a silent but brutal protest that said everything about the bitterness left between them. And fans noticed. Reporters noticed. The tension became one of those whispered Hollywood truths. Everyone knew Carroll and Reiner no longer spoke, but nobody wanted to ask too directly. The chemistry that once lit up living rooms had frozen solid. Now, here's the question. Do you think Rob Reiner was wrong for calling Archie dangerous? Or do you think Carroll O'Connor couldn't accept that his character might have inspired the very attitudes he hoped to expose? Either way, the fallout was permanent. The father-son dynamic that defined All in the Family, Archie and Meathead, clashing and reconciling, was left behind on set. Off-screen, their relationship became a ghost, something Carroll refused to resurrect even decades later. And that's the haunting part. Carroll O'Connor, who fought so hard for his character, who defended Archie against critics, who carried the weight of being both loved and hated by America, found his deepest wound not in the boardrooms of CBS or the heated battles with Norman Lear, but in the words of his own co-star. And it makes you wonder, how does a man who gave so much to a role cope when the people closest to him dismiss that legacy? Because Carroll's silence on Rob Reiner wasn't just silence, it was punishment. It was his way of saying, "You don't exist in my story anymore." But if you think this was Carroll O'Connor's most painful falling out, you'd be wrong. The feud with Rob Reiner was sharp, yes, but the wound that cut deepest wasn't with a man at all. It was with the woman he called his daughter. So here's the real question. How do you go from playing America's favorite TV family to never speaking again with the actress who shared your living room couch? The Sally Struthers tragedy.
What do you mean coming downstairs in front of your father dressed like that? Put some clothes on you.
I got some clothes on.
Where?
Here.
Sally Struthers was like a daughter to Carroll O'Connor until tragedy tore them apart. On screen, Sally played Gloria Stivic, Archie Bunker's daughter, forever caught in the crossfire between her father's old-school beliefs and her husband Mike's idealism. Off-screen, something special happened. Carroll wasn't just her TV father, he became a real one too. Sally would later say she gained a father during All in the Family. Carroll filled that space in her life with guidance, advice, and unconditional support. For years, they spoke daily, confided in each other, and shared a bond closer than most real families. Carroll even described her once as the daughter I never had. But in 1995, the bond that seemed unbreakable was tested by an event no parent should endure. Carroll's real son, Hugh O'Connor, just 32 years old, took his own life after a long battle with addiction. The news shattered Carroll completely. His grief was public, raw, and unforgettable. Many fans still remember the press conference where he used his son's death to call for tougher action against drug dealers, even naming the man who supplied Hugh. Behind that fiery moment was a father drowning in pain, and this is where Sally Struthers comes back into the story. In moments like that, family usually closes ranks. But Sally stayed silent. She later admitted, "I didn't know what to say when Hugh died, so I stayed silent. And that was the worst thing I could have done." Those words capture the mistake that cost her one of the most important relationships of her life. Carroll noticed her silence, and it cut him deeply. For a man who always believed loyalty meant everything, her absence during his darkest hour felt like betrayal. It wasn't just about a missed phone call or a letter. To Carroll, it was proof that when he needed her most, his daughter didn't show up. That silence built into a wall that neither could climb over. Years later, Carroll himself spoke about it in a rare confession when he was 74. He said, "Sally was like a daughter to me. We were so close, maybe too close for it to survive everything that came after." In that one sentence, you can feel the heartbreak of a man who realized some bonds don't survive tragedy. But it wasn't quite over yet. There was one last attempt to make peace. Sally tried to call Carroll later, reaching out to rebuild what they'd lost. But the call went nowhere. Carroll was polite but distant, unwilling to open the door again. After that, the relationship was gone. Not in a dramatic fight or explosive argument, but in something colder. Silence. And maybe that's the most haunting part. For all the fights Carroll had with Norman Lear, for all the bitterness with Rob Reiner, it was silence that hurt the most when it came to Sally Struthers. The silence after Hugh's death, and the silence that followed their failed reunion, turned a father-daughter bond into a ghost of what it once was. And here's where I want to ask you, what do you think you would have done if you were Sally? Do you think silence is better than saying the wrong thing? Or do you believe Carroll was right to see that silence as abandonment? Because this wasn't just a falling out, It was the tragedy of two people who loved each other like family, but couldn't bridge the gap when grief demanded more than words. For viewers who only saw Archie and Gloria bickering on the couch, it's almost impossible to imagine the real-life bond and the real-life break. But Carroll himself never softened on it. By the end of his life, he spoke warmly of Jean Stapleton. He even mentioned Norman Lear with grudging respect. But about Sally Struthers, there was only that single confession. She was like a daughter and maybe too close to survive. And that leaves us with the question, was Carroll O'Connor truly the villain in these stories? Or was he just a man who demanded loyalty and couldn't forgive its absence? The answer, I think, lies in his bond with Jean Stapleton. Because if Sally Struthers was the tragedy, Jean Stapleton was the redemption. So here's the next question. What did Carroll O'Connor's lifelong friendship with Jean Stapleton reveal about who he really was, beneath Archie Bunker, beneath the fights, and beneath the grief? The Jean Stapleton exception.
No, nothing happened between you, but I thought I was gonna lose you, so I had to see you.
But not every bond Carroll O'Connor had with his co-stars ended in silence. If his falling out with Sally Struthers was the tragedy, then Jean Stapleton was the exception, the living proof that Carroll O'Connor's story wasn't about hate at all. In fact, his friendship with her may be the clearest window into who he really was beneath Archie Bunker. Carroll O'Connor once called Jean Stapleton a true American revolutionary. That is not a throwaway line. This was a man famous for feuds, for protecting scripts like a bulldog, and for battling Norman Lear and erasing Rob Reiner from interviews. Yet when he spoke of Jean Stapleton, his words sounded more like poetry than criticism. He wrote, "The benign, compassionate presence she developed made my egregious churl bearable." Think about that. This is from the man at the center of it all. And yet he admitted that without Jean Stapleton, Archie Bunker simply wouldn't have worked. These are not the words of a bitter man. They are the words of someone who knew art only survives if the people around you make it human. The secret was balance. Jean Stapleton never fought Carroll O'Connor the way Norman Lear did. She never tried to rewrite him the way Rob Reiner did. Instead, she elevated him. She leaned into Edith's softness, her patience, and her almost saint-like optimism, so that Archie's roughness didn't tip into cruelty. It created a chemistry that audiences could love, even when Archie was at his worst. And Carroll knew it. He respected it. He praised it every chance he got. When Jean Stapleton passed away in 2013, long after Carroll's own death, reporters dug up his words about her, and they read like a love letter. She was an extraordinary actress. The benign, compassionate presence she developed made my egregious churl bearable. Words like that don't come from a man filled with hatred. They come from a man who knew what it meant to be seen and supported. But even with Jean, the story wasn't without pain. One of the most controversial decisions in All in the Family history came when Edith Bunker was killed off. Jean Stapleton had decided to leave the series, and Carroll O'Connor supported her choice, but the execution of it still haunted him. In a spin-off episode of Archie Bunker's Place, Edith's death is revealed quietly, almost offhand. She has died of a stroke. There is no grand goodbye, no family gathered at her side. Just Archie, left alone in his chair, grieving silently. Fans were devastated. Critics questioned whether the show had mishandled one of television's most beloved characters. And Carroll himself would later admit that Edith's death was one of his deepest regrets. He once reflected that losing Jean Stapleton wasn't just losing a co-star. It was losing the other half of the show's heart. He knew that Edith's presence had made Archie more human by making him softer. Without her, Archie was left raw, exposed, and less forgiving. This regret mattered because it proved something crucial. Carroll's conflicts with his co-stars weren't about hatred. They were about survival, about protecting the delicate balance of a show that lived and died on tone. He wasn't lashing out to be cruel. He was guarding something he knew was fragile. With Norman Lear, the fight was over whether Archie was too monstrous. With Rob Reiner, it was over whether Archie was dangerous. With Sally Struthers, it was about silence in grief. But with Gene Stapleton, there was no fight, no bitterness, no betrayal, just mutual respect and admiration. And that raises a question we should all sit with. If Carroll O'Connor truly hated his co-stars, how do you explain his words about Gene? How do you explain calling her a revolutionary? How do you explain praising her as the very reason his character worked? Hate doesn't sound like that. Protection does. Love does. What makes this even more powerful is that Carroll wasn't an easy man to please. He carried a reputation as a perfectionist, sometimes even difficult. Crew members called him stubborn. Writers called him controlling. Norman Lear called him combative. And yet, Gene Stapleton never once had a negative word about him. In interviews, she described Carroll as brilliant, complicated, and deeply committed to the craft. She understood him, maybe more than anyone else on that set. That's why their partnership still stands as one of the greatest in television history. Archie and Edith Bunker weren't just characters. They were reflections of Carroll and Gene's ability to trust each other completely. Edith's warmth wasn't scripted sweetness. It was Gene bringing her soul to the screen. And Archie's humanity, buried under sarcasm and bluster, was Carroll allowing Gene to soften his edges. So, when you hear people talk about Carroll O'Connor's off-camera battles, remember this. His story isn't about who he hated. It's about who he trusted. Gene Stapleton was the exception that proved the rule. The living proof that Carroll O'Connor wasn't a bitter man at war with his colleagues, but an artist trying to defend something fragile, something real. And that leads us to the final question, because if Carroll O'Connor didn't hate his co-stars, then maybe the real issue was never inside that studio at all. Maybe the real issue was outside, in the living rooms of America. So, the real question isn't who Carroll O'Connor hated. It's why America hated him for playing Archie too well. It was never really about hate. What we've uncovered is that his so-called hatred was really hurt. The sting of silence, the disappointment of broken loyalties, and the burden of being mistaken for Archie himself. Protecting the craft cost him friends, family ties, and peace. So, the tragedy isn't who Carroll O'Connor hated, but how television's most controversial role bled into his real life. Do you think he was misunderstood? Or did he expect too much loyalty? And the bigger question, what's the true price of telling uncomfortable truths on TV? Drop your comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.